Mr. President, I became a member of this society in 1973. And so it is with some trepidation that I tonight give my maiden speech. I have listened to the proponents and to the opponents, and I'm afraid there's a great deal to obscure the issue. I say to my Estonian friend, I agreed with every word you said. And to my Afghan friend, we were together in that country at a critical time in 2009. I served there. I agreed with what you had to say. But the proposition tonight is not, should we support democracy? Of course we should support democracy. The proposition is not, should we never fight? Yes, there are times we should fight, and we have fought successfully. I don't have to go back in the lifetime of anybody here. We did it successfully in the Balkans in the 1990s. The issue is, and to stop a genocide, the issue is, should we be fighting for democracy? That specific point of going to war. This is not supporting, it's fighting. And incidentally, it works a heck of a lot better when other people do the fighting. We should give the Ukrainians everything they need because they're doing the fighting and we are not. So that is an entirely different proposition. Now, I say to my friend John Bolton, and we've been friends and sometimes even in agreement, particularly on questions of Kurdistan, a small corner of the world of agreement. I say to him, the test has to be effectiveness. Great, what a wonderful thing to say about Cuba. We've been pursuing that policy for 65 years. You could have been born when we started to get rid of the Castro brothers, and you would be getting your pension now. Whatever you can say about our policies toward Cuba, they haven't worked. And that, my friend, is the only question that concerns whether we should be fighting for democracy. The test has to be, is it effective? And let's be clear. When we talk about fighting for democracy, we're not talking about fighting alongside democracies. Yes, we did that in World War II. We weren't fighting for democracy, we were fighting for survival. And we did that in the Gulf War I. We sure as hell weren't fighting for democracy when we liberated Kuwait. We were fighting for the rules-based international order. So that's just not an issue. I can really only think of two major wars that were fought for democracy. Both were wildly expensive in terms of money and did not produce democracy. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrate why it is not feasible to fight for democracy outside the West. Nothing to do whether it's desirable, simply feasible. Let's consider what happened in Afghanistan. First, it didn't begin as a war for democracy. It began as a war to destroy Al-Qaeda, the organization behind the 9/11 attacks, and to oust the Taliban. And that goal was accomplished within a couple of months. U.S. Special Forces entered Afghanistan in October of 2001, and the Taliban were gone by December. It was done at very low cost. A few some airstrikes, and again, a few special forces. Why did it work? Because the U.S. fought alongside a local partner, the Tajik-led Northern Alliance, and they did most of the fighting. But having accomplished that goal, what did the Bush administration do? It could have let the Northern Alliance sort things out with other Afghans, but no. In a display of hubris and ignorance, it decided that it would make Afghanistan into the kind of democracy it thought Afghanistan should be. So it brokered a constitution of Afghanistan, one of the most diverse countries ethnically and geographically in the world, that created a highly centralized government with all power concentrated in Kabul, and in Kabul, all power concentrated in the person of the president, who, of course, could only come from one ethnic group. And so what was the inevitable result? With so much power at stake in one person, a series of elections that were massively fraudulent, 2009, 2014, 2019, and then we pretended it was democracy. So what was it? A two-month war to defeat the Taliban became a 20-year war for democracy. A low-cost operation ended up costing $2.1 trillion, according to Brown University, with thousands of NATO's deaths and hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives lost. Do I need to ask how it turned out? Well, let me tell you my little experience in Afghanistan. I first visited Afghanistan on February 14th, 1989, in a trip arranged by your former president with the Mujahideen, the people fighting against the Soviet-backed puppet regime. Now, what was special about that day? It was the day the Soviets withdrew. And what happened after the Soviets withdrew? The Soviet-backed puppet regime lasted 3 more years, a year longer than the Soviet Union itself. Now, what about the American-backed democratic regime in Afghanistan? Well, that one, after having spent $200 billion on an army, security forces of 200,000, that fell to 60,000 Taliban fighters in pickup trucks with mounted machine guns. It fell 2 weeks before the American withdrawal was completed. You can't imagine anything that better illustrates the folly of wars to fight for democracy outside of the West. Oh, except possibly for, oh yes, Iraq. 20 years after invading Iraq, troops are still there, US troops. A war with the stated purpose of eliminating non-existent weapons of mass destruction morphed almost immediately into an effort to create in Iraq a Western-style free market democracy whose examples would transform the Middle East. After toppling Saddam, the United States and the United Kingdom set up a coalition provisional authority to run and remake Iraq, staffed by recruits from the right-wing Heritage Foundation and places like it. The CPA was full of people with lots of ideas of democracy and free markets. Too bad they didn't have anybody who knew anything about Iraq, had ever served there, about the Middle East, or even about post-conflict situations. They passed 100 laws in the 15 months. They had all these programs for democracy, and guess what happened when Iraqis went to the polls? And they went to polls in indisputably free and fair elections in January of 2005. They didn't vote for any of the multi-ethnic parties that we wanted. The Kurds voted for Kurdish nationalist parties whose agenda was to get out of Iraq, and still is, and it should be. And they voted for Shiite religious parties closely associated with Iran. In fact, one of them, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, you kind of get a clue from the name that it wasn't like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Labor Party. You know, that was their agenda. And today, what is Iran's closest ally in the entire world? Why, it's Iraq. Okay, that's democracy. But really, was it worth now $3 trillion and the loss of more than 8,000 NATO fighters to hand Iran a foreign policy success that it had fought 8 years to achieve in the Iran-Iraq war? But again, I'm not against intervention. In the 90s, and I disagree with my dear friend here, the US intervened twice in the Balkans. In 1995, we used a combination of airstrikes and diplomacy to end a genocidal war in Bosnia, then followed it up with the deployment of 35,000 NATO troops. In '99, we used air power to oust the Serbia from Kosovo, and then troops to facilitate the transition to what eventually became an independent country. You know what the cost of those two operations were? Bosnia and Kosovo? $30 billion combined. How many NATO soldiers died? How many American soldiers? Anybody know? The answer is 0. So what's the difference? How could these interventions work and the others be so disastrous, aside from the fact that I was involved in those and Bolton and the others? It's quite simple. Western interventions in the Balkans supported local parties to accomplish their objectives, ending genocide in Bosnia, independence in the case of Kosovo, and unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not reshape the fight to impose our ideas of democracy. And so it is with Ukraine. Although Ukraine is a democracy, our fight in the West fight is not, first, the West is not fighting in Ukraine for democracy. The West isn't fighting in Ukraine at all. And the fight is actually not about democracy. It's about helping the Ukrainian people resist an illegal aggression by Russia. And with our help, the Ukrainians have done amazingly well. So we certainly don't want to screw it up by sending in our own troops. Now, while I oppose this motion to fight for democracy, we can and should support democracy everywhere. But I'm sorry to say, the US and the West are very inconsistent on this point. The Nixon administration plotted to overthrow the democratically elected government of Chile because they didn't like what the Chilean people had chosen. When Pinochet overthrew him, he was embraced by the Reagan administration. My friend John Bolton was part of that. And when finally he was ousted, who was it that was trying to save him from being prosecuted in Spain, a European democracy, for murdering Spanish citizens? Why, the lobbyist was none other than Margaret Thatcher. And the Reagan administration, it supported South Africa's apartheid regime, vetoing congressional sanctions on South Africa, and designated the African National Congress's military wing to be a terrorist organization. The people actually who were fighting for democracy in South Africa. And closer to home for this body, and very personal for me, the Reagan administration tried to obstruct my efforts to get Benazir Bhutto out of brutal imprisonment in a Class C cell in Sucker Desert in 1981. They even prohibited US diplomats from speaking to the Bhutto family. It was better, Reagan judged, for America to keep in the good graces of Pakistan's brutal dictator, Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, than to save the life of the leader who was trying to restore democracy in Pakistan. And this pattern continues to this day. On September 25th, 2017, in one of the most democratic, possibly the most democratic election ever held in the Middle East, the people of Iraqi Kurdistan voted 93% for independence, with close to 90% participation. And how did the Trump administration respond to this? They allowed Abu Mahdi Mohandas, a man who was actually convicted of blowing up the US Embassy in Kuwait in 1984, they allowed him and his militia in an operation directed by Qasem Soleimani to use American Abrams tanks to attack the Kurds who had just voted in a democratic election and who were America's friends in the Middle East. I dare say America's most reliable friends in the Middle East. And I know that John Bolton and I agree on this point, so I can't hold. And he was not part. There was a few bright moments when he was National Security Advisor. It went bad before and bad after. And I won't discuss, because several people have made it, the ongoing effort to ingratiate ourselves with Mohammed bin Salman, Who's this? The de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, the war in Yemen that's claimed 350,000 lives, who shook down the members of the royal family for billions, who invited the prime minister of Lebanon, the elected prime minister of Lebanon, to Saudi Arabia, imprisoned him and forced him to resign, and who ordered the murder of an American journalist in the Turkish consulate in Istanbul and for his body to be cut in pieces. So before we decide to fight for democracy, let's begin by merely standing up for democracy. Finally, and my father, who gave many speeches, said you should always use finally in his speech, especially at this time of night, because it gives your audience hope. We don't need to go to the far corners of the world to fight for, to find imperiled democracies for which we can fight. We could start with the United States. I served as the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, a formerly communist country, then trying to make the transition from dictatorship to democracy. Part of my job as an American diplomat was to give lectures on democracy. I would be embarrassed to do so today. Two of the essential features of a successful democracy are: one, an independent judiciary that can be relied upon to settle political disputes in a nonpartisan manner, and two, political parties that accept the results of elections they lose. Neither of these essential features of democracy exist in the United States today. A defining characteristic of a nonpartisan judiciary is this: faced with identical law and identical facts, a nonpartisan court, a real court, will come to the same decision without regard to the political party of the plaintiff or of the defendant. But that's not true of the U.S. judiciary. In a decision in December of 2000, and John Bolton was part of that, the U.S. Supreme Court decided 5-4 to halt the Florida recount when George Bush was a few hundred votes ahead of Al Gore, and in effect handed him the presidency. No serious person believes those 5 Republican Supreme Court members would have taken the same decision if Gore had been a few hundred votes ahead of Bush. And since 2000, the Supreme Court has become more partisan, more extreme right-wing, more an instrument of the Republican Party. 1 minute, John, I'll come back to you.
Would you have understood it to be the wrong result if the court had said, stop the recount earlier because they're violating the Constitution, which is fundamentally what
They had nothing to do with the Constitution. You mean the other 4 justices, incidentally 2 of whom were appointed by Republican presidents, they were against the Constitution. This was an entirely partisan exercise to put the guy they wanted in on the court. And I'll come back to you. And then there was January 6th. We'll come to, you want to talk about January 6th? Let's.
denial, which is what you've just done.
January 6th. As bad as it was, storming the U.S. Capitol, that wasn't the worst thing that happened on January 6th. It was that a majority of the Republicans in Congress, that is a majority of the Republicans elected to national office in the United States, voted to overturn an election that was indisputably free and fair, that Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. And let's be clear, American democracy in 2020 was not saved by the courts or the Congress, but rather by the incompetence of Donald Trump and the gang of clowns like Rudy Giuliani. In 2024, the anti-democracy gang in America will be much better prepared. In a case out of North Carolina, the Supreme Court appears poised to overturn 2 centuries of U.S. voting by saying that gerrymandered Republican state legislatures are entitled to ignore the vote in their states and appoint their own electors. Had such a decision been handed down and before the 2020 election, Donald Trump and not Joe Biden would be US president today. So let me say, rather than looking for authoritarian dragons to slay far from home, Americans should be fighting to save our democracy at home. Thank you.